Daniel woke up every day to the blaring sound of his alarm clock. It wasn't just the noise that bothered him, but the feeling of an invisible weight that seemed to be present even before he opened his eyes. The city was alive around him, honking horns, hurried footsteps, endless notifications on his phone. It was a cycle that seemed never-ending, as if the clock was spinning without ever giving him a chance to breathe. Working at a large company, Daniel was admired for being productive. His boss praised him for the number of tasks he completed, but he knew something was wrong. Amidst emails, meetings, and instant messages, he began to realize that he could no longer hear his own inner voice. When was the last time he had a true moment of silence? When was the last time he simply existed? One night, after another long and exhausting day, Daniel returned home and collapsed onto the sofa. He grabbed his phone as he did automatically and began scrolling through social media. It was like a black hole. Short videos, bright photos, people living the perfect life. But inside he felt empty. A void so deep that for the first time he was scared. It felt as though he was lost in a maze he had built himself. That night he had a dream. In the dream, he was standing at a crossroads in the middle of a vast, silent field. Two paths lay before him. The one on the right seemed peaceful and sunny, with trees dancing to the wind's rhythm. The one on the left was dark, filled with screams and shadows that seemed to whisper his name. Daniel knew he was facing a choice, but before he could decide, he woke up. The next day something different happened. As he walked to work, he noticed a musician playing guitar in a square. For a moment he stopped. The music was soft, almost magical. For the first time in a long time, Daniel stood still. A tear slipped down his cheek, and he realized how far he had drifted from himself. The music seemed to whisper, "You're still here, Daniel. Don't lose yourself completely." It was in that moment that he began to question. Where was his life heading? Was it possible to find the peace he had seen in his dream? Or was he destined to walk the dark path, where the internal war never ended? He realized he was facing a real choice. Over the days, Daniel began to change small habits. He put his phone aside during meals. He started walking alone without earphones. He allowed himself a moment at the end of each day to simply sit and listen to his own thoughts. It wasn't easy. Sometimes the thoughts were painful. Other times they were too silent. But little by little he began to feel something different. It wasn't instant happiness. It was something deeper, a glimpse of peace. Daniel's story is the story of many of us. We are so caught up in the demands of the modern world that we forget what it means to truly live. But as Daniel discovered, it's never too late to stop, reflect, and choose the path that leads to our inner peace. And you? Which path will you choose? Daniel lived like many of us. He woke up, rushed to work, filled every second of his day with obligations, and in the little free time he had left, sought distractions. It wasn't that he didn't know something was wrong, he did. He could feel it in his chest like a constant weight, an unease he couldn't name. But instead of facing it, he tried to silence it with seemingly harmless choices. In the mornings, his coffee was consumed in a hurry while he scrolled through his social media feed. There he saw people who always seemed happier, more successful, more fulfilled. Daniel felt smaller with each post. "I'll just take a quick look," he would tell himself. But without realizing it, that habit not only stole his time but also his peace. Instead of starting his day with a moment of reflection or purpose, he already felt behind in a race whose finish line he didn't know. At work it was no different. He kept superficial conversations with coworkers, avoiding opening up or forming real connections. Some of these people made him feel drained, subtle criticisms, excessive demands, negative energy. Daniel knew they were toxic relationships, but he kept them out of convenience. After all, it was easier to stay than to confront or walk away. And when he finally got home at night, Daniel was exhausted, turning on the TV and watching whatever seemed like the only way to relax. But in reality, he wasn't relaxing. The content he chose was always intense, loud, full of conflict and violence. Without realizing it, he was feeding the inner war that accompanied him daily. His already overloaded mind never found rest. Then came the turning point. On one particularly quiet evening, as he switched channels without finding anything that truly interested him, Daniel felt a wave of sadness so deep that he couldn't ignore it. He asked himself, "Why do I feel so empty even with everything I have around me?" It was a question he had always avoided, but that night, he couldn't run from it. Daniel began to observe his own habits. He realized that every decision he made, from what he consumed to who he chose to be around, was building a wall between him and his true self. Each choice seemed small, but together they created an invisible weight he carried every day. He decided to change. Not all at once, but one step at a time. In the mornings, instead of grabbing his phone, he started to spend 5 minutes simply breathing and planning his day. At work, he began setting clear boundaries and avoiding toxic conversations. It wasn't easy. Distancing himself from harmful relationships was painful. But little by little, he realized that this decision created space for more meaningful people and interactions. And at night, instead of turning on the TV, he began doing something he hadn't done in years: writing. At first, it was just scattered words, but soon it became a way for him to reconnect with himself. Writing brought out emotions, fears, and desires he didn't even know still existed. Daniel learned that the invisible weight of daily choices can lead us into a silent internal war. But he also discovered that by becoming aware of those choices, it's possible to find the path back to peace. And you? What choices are you making today? Are they feeding your inner war or building the bridge to your peace? The power to change is in your hands, and it's never too late to start. Daniel lived in a city that never slept. The streets were always alive with the sound of honking horns, hurried footsteps, and the fragmented conversations of strangers. He was just another face in the crowd, one of the thousands crossing the city daily, immersed in an automatic routine. His headphones were always on, filling any emptiness with music and podcasts. His phone vibrated constantly, as if the world demanded his attention every second. One day, which seemed like any other, Daniel had a setback. An important email was lost, a call was cut off, and the subway stalled between stations for minutes that felt like hours. Annoyed and frustrated, he decided to get off at the next station and walk to his destination, even if it was farther. It was a desperate attempt to shake off the discomfort that seemed stuck in his chest. As he walked, something caught his attention: a small park hidden among the skyscrapers. He had never noticed this place despite passing by it countless times. On impulse, he decided to enter. The shade from the trees offered an unexpected relief, and the sound of the city seemed distant. He found an empty bench and sat down. For a moment he thought about grabbing his phone, but for the first time in years he resisted. The silence was uncomfortable at first. His mind began firing thoughts like fireworks. Forgotten memories surfaced, moments from childhood, smiles he hadn't seen in years, and regrets he had always tried to bury. The absence of external distractions forced him to face what he had been avoiding. It was as if a dam had broken and everything he had suppressed flowed out at once. Daniel took a deep breath. He had never stopped to listen to himself. He felt a mix of relief and pain, as if the silence was both a balm and a mirror. He asked himself, "How did I get here? Where am I going?" For the first time, he realized he had been walking a path he hadn't consciously chosen. He looked around. There were children playing, birds singing, the soft sound of leaves rustling in the wind. It was such a stark contrast to the rush of his life that Daniel felt small. He realized he no longer knew how to appreciate the simple things. He realized he had filled his life with noise because he was afraid of silence. That day, Daniel didn't find all the answers he was looking for, but he found something even more valuable: the awareness that he needed to stop running. The silence, which once seemed frightening, became an invitation to reconnect with who he truly was. After that, Daniel began to carve out daily moments for silence. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. At first, it was uncomfortable, but over time, it became a refuge. He began to see more clearly what really mattered and which paths he wanted to take. Daniel's story reminds us of something essential. In the midst of life's chaos, silence is a gift that many avoid, but it can help us return to ourselves. Maybe it's time for you to heed the call of silence as well. After all, when was the last time you stopped to listen to your own soul? Let me know if you need further revisions. For Daniel had always had a voice in his head. In the beginning, he thought this was normal, as if everyone had a little internal advisor who commented on their choices, fears, and doubts. But as the years went by, those voices began to multiply. Little by little, the sound that once seemed gentle grew louder, until it became a constant battle inside his mind. He woke up every day with the weight of a war he didn't know how to win. Sometimes, the voice of the fear of failure was the loudest. What if I'm not good enough? What if my choices lead to something I can no longer control? The fear of making mistakes, of not meeting the expectations he placed on himself, haunted him with every step. But that wasn't all. There was also the voice of the need to please others. What will they think of me if I don't do this? Will they judge me? Daniel constantly felt indebted to the people around him. He couldn't say no, he couldn't set boundaries. The opinions of others seemed to be the compass he followed, even though it led him down a path of exhaustion and frustration. And behind these voices there was another, quieter, but even deeper one. The voice of insecurity about the future. Am I doing the right thing? What if I don't achieve everything I want? What if life passes by and I realize I haven't lived the way I should have? The future seemed like a vast abyss ahead, and Daniel, although he knew he couldn't control everything, tried to hold on to anything that gave him some sense of security. But the more he tried to control, the more the future slipped through his fingers. And finally there was the voice of guilt, the heaviest of them all. I should have enjoyed the moment more. I should have lived differently without worrying so much about what others think. I should have paid more attention to what really matters. This voice made him feel like he was always one step behind himself, regretful for not having made wiser choices in the past. These voices were at war within Daniel. One spoke while he tried to rest, another emerged when he made a decision, and yet another accompanied him while he walked through the city, distracted, trying to escape from himself. It was like a constant noise that prevented him from hearing his own essence. He could no longer distinguish what was truly important, what he wanted, or what he needed. He was being dragged by these internal forces, not knowing how to stop. It was then, in a moment of exhaustion, that Daniel realized something important. He had been living for others' expectations and the fear of what might happen, but never for himself. He hadn't heard his own voice in years. He had allowed fear, insecurity, guilt, and the need for approval to govern his life, as if it were a lost battle. The turning point came on an ordinary morning. He was sitting in the park, alone, trying to have a coffee while the voices in his head spoke in unison. But for the first time he allowed himself to stop and hear the truth amid that confusion. He didn't need to please everyone. He didn't need to fear the future or carry the guilt of the past. He could choose which voice to listen to. From that moment on, Daniel began to distinguish each of these voices. He understood that fear didn't have to control his life. He also learned to listen to his inner voice, the one that told him he was enough, that he had the right to fail and learn, that he didn't need to compare himself to others. He started taking small but consistent actions to slow down and seek balance. Daniel realized that the control he had been searching for wasn't in the voices that overwhelmed him, but in his ability to choose which one he would give more attention to. Daniel's story isn't unique. We all face these internal voices that are often at war with us. But as Daniel learned, we can learn to silence the ones that don't serve us and listen to the ones that truly matter. The secret isn't in eliminating all the voices, but in finding the courage to listen to the truest one of all, our own. And you, which voices have been dominating your life? Is it time to choose which one you will follow? Daniel was sitting at his desk, the office lights reflecting on the screens of the computers in front of him. It was just another typical day, endless meetings, emails that never stopped coming, the pressure of meeting deadlines. Stress seemed to have become part of his identity, and he could no longer distinguish where work ended and his personal life began. Every task seemed urgent, every email an emergency. But in that moment something unexpected happened. As he typed absent-mindedly, a light breeze entered through the window, bringing the scent of rain that was approaching. It was in this simple gesture, this slight change in the air, that a memory from a distant time began to surface. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He found himself not in that office but in a vast, green and tranquil field. He was only 8 years old. The memory was vivid. He ran through the field, carefree, with the laughter of his friends in the background. There were no clocks, no pressures. He remembers sitting under a tree, feeling the breeze on his face and simply existing. There were no external expectations, no rush. He was present, fully in the moment. And more importantly, he was at peace. Then, like a wave crashing on the shore, the memory faded. Daniel slowly opened his eyes and found himself back in his reality. But something inside him had changed. That feeling of peace he had experienced as a child, a kind of peace that felt natural and easy, now seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. How had he drifted so far from something so simple and essential? When had he traded those calm, genuinely joyful moments for obligations and self-imposed pressures? In the days that followed, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about those memories. He began to question himself. How did I get here? What happened to that childlike peace? He realized how, over the years, his life had transformed into a relentless pursuit of external approval. He had swapped lazy afternoons for more work. He had swapped outdoor walks for a constant search for recognition. He had swapped the joy of a good book for the pressure of consuming content quickly and superficially. He had swapped calm for rush, being for having. He realized that, over the years, he had distanced himself from that peace for one simple reason: the need for validation. He was always chasing the next goal, the next achievement, the next approval. What he didn't understand was that by seeking these external validations, he had disconnected from his true essence. He had lost access to the peace that was his by right. It was then, on a weekend with no commitments, that Daniel decided to do something radically simple: turn off his phone and leave the house. He went to the park with no hurry to return, no obligation to do something productive. He sat on the grass and for the first time in a long time, felt the warm sun on his face, heard the birds singing and allowed himself to simply breathe. While he was there, something incredible happened. He felt the inner silence he had lost so long ago. That sensation of being present, of being at peace, slowly returned. It wasn't anything grand, but it was real. Daniel realized that peace wasn't distant. It had always been there, within reach of his choices. He just needed to slow down enough to find it again. In the days that followed, Daniel made small adjustments. He started dedicating time to himself without guilt. He reserved moments to walk, to sit and read, to simply be with the people he loved. He began to give less attention to external demands and more focus to what made him feel truly alive. Slowly, he began to realize that peace wasn't in being the best or in being recognized, but in simply being. Daniel's story is a reflection of many of us. The relentless search for achievements and external validations can take us away from the simplest and most precious things in life. But, as Daniel discovered, the peace we long for isn't something we need to conquer. It is within us, just waiting to be found, like a soft echo that resonates in our hearts, reminding us of who we truly are. And you, when was the last time you allowed yourself to stop and listen to the echoes of forgotten peace? Perhaps it's time to slow down, return to simplicity, and reconnect with what really matters. Daniel sat at his desk once again, fingers hovering over the keyboard but not actually typing. He stared at the social media feed with a sense of emptiness. It was filled with posts, travel photos, statuses of happiness and achievements, and as always he found himself immersed in this virtual world. Notifications popped up incessantly, grabbing his attention, but something inside him felt like something was missing. The day passed in a blur. Daniel scrolled up and down the screen without truly paying attention to what he was seeing, yet still couldn't stop. It felt like a compulsive habit, a routine where the emptiness grew with every scroll, but he couldn't break the cycle. Minutes turned into hours, hours into days. When he finally looked out the window, he noticed the sun had set, and he had barely lived the day. The feeling of being lost was growing stronger. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint what. It wasn't the work or the responsibilities, it was the fact that he was trapped in this constant flow of information and distractions, as if he were in a maze with no way out. A maze he had created himself. That night, as he prepared to sleep, Daniel found himself reflecting on how his life had become a reflection of that maze. He remembered when he was younger and life seemed simpler. As a child, he spent hours playing in the park, riding his bike, exploring the world around him. Back then, time seemed to expand and he felt in direct contact with his own being. But now, he felt disconnected from everything. The peace that once came naturally now seemed like a distant concept, like a vague memory he couldn't reach. How did I get here? He thought, as the emptiness of the television screen reflected in his eyes. Why does it feel like I'm always chasing something I can never reach? He felt that, no matter how much he consumed, no matter how many people and pieces of information he interacted with, something inside him remained absent. He was trapped but didn't know how to escape. It was then, in a moment of mental exhaustion, that Daniel realized something profound. He saw that the maze wasn't something external to him but something he had created himself. The mindless consumption, the incessant need for approval, the days filled with empty activities, everything had disconnected him from himself. He had gotten lost in a world that made no sense, a reality manufactured by societal pressures, others' expectations and constant comparison. Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He realized that even though he was lost in this maze, the way out wasn't through more distractions or accomplishments. The peace he was looking for had always been inside him. It always had been. Modern life, with its traps and empty promises, had pushed him away from this essential truth. He had imprisoned himself in an endless cycle of searching for something he already had: his own inner peace. The next day, Daniel made a decision. He turned off his social media, at least for a while. He began walking without hurry, looking up at the sky, feeling the wind. He stopped chasing something he didn't even know. In the silence, he found a peace he had lost sight of. He began talking to himself, reconnecting with the things that truly mattered. Little by little, he freed himself from the maze of disconnection, finding his way back to his essence. Over time, Daniel understood something crucial. The maze of modern life is not a physical place but a mental trap. He realized that true peace had never been in anything external but in his ability to stop and listen to his own voice. By doing so, he was able to free himself from the endless search for validation, recognition, for more and more, and reconnect with what truly mattered. Daniel's story reflects many of ours. We are all immersed in a maze of distractions, pressures, and expectations. But just like Daniel, we can choose to stop, look inward, and realize that the peace we've been searching for is already within our reach. The first step out of this maze is realizing that there's no place to get to. The peace is inside of us, waiting to be found. And you? Are you ready to step out of the maze and reconnect with the peace that is already yours? Perhaps the first step is simply to stop and breathe. Daniel walked down the building stairs, exhausted after another long day of work. His mind was filled with scattered thoughts, but there was something else bothering him. He couldn't remember the last time he felt truly at peace with himself. The internal voices were louder than ever, and he could barely hear his own feelings. His body was drained, but his soul seemed to be in an even deeper state of weariness. Then he saw him. Elias. A man with white hair and calm eyes, sitting on a bench in the building's common area. He seemed to exude a serene presence, as if he had found something that Daniel didn't yet know how to seek. Elias was always there in a quiet corner, but never seemed rushed or anxious. There was something about him that inspired calm, an energy that contrasted with Daniel's frantic routine. For a moment, Daniel thought of continuing on his way as usual, but something stopped him. It was as if an invisible force had drawn him toward the bench where Elias was sitting. He hesitated, but, noticing there was no one else around, approached. Elias looked at him with a gentle smile, as if he had been waiting. Daniel, somewhat uncomfortable, asked, "You're always here, huh? How do you have so much time and calm?" Elias chuckled softly, and his voice had a deep, peaceful tone. "Time isn't a problem when you learn to use it for what truly matters." Elias's answer left Daniel speechless, but something in his gaze made him want to understand more. He sat beside the elderly man, and for a moment, the silence between them was comfortable, not forced. Elias then broke the silence with a simple question, one that resonated deeply in Daniel's mind. "What do you really value, Daniel? What, deep down, makes your heart beat faster?" Daniel felt unsettled by the question. He had never really thought about it clearly. The things he valued seemed to be constantly changing, often influenced by what society said was important. Work, achievements, the search for more. But deep down he knew there was something else, something he already had but didn't know how to access. I don't know. I think, deep down, I value recognition, the things I can achieve. But I'm not sure if that really fulfills me." Elias looked at him attentively and then asked another, even deeper question. "And if no one was watching? What would you do?" This question made Daniel fall silent for a few seconds. He had never thought about that. In the world he lived in, where social media and external expectations dictated his life, he always acted in search of approval, recognition. But if no one was watching? What would he do? What would he do if the world's expectations didn't pressure him to be something he wasn't? After a long silence, Daniel said, "I think I would spend more time with the people I love. I'd like to have more moments of peace, to be present instead of always chasing more and more. But I've lost myself in this, Elias. I don't know how to find my way back." Elias smiled, a calm smile, as if he completely understood what Daniel was feeling. He gently placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "The return isn't complicated, my friend, but it requires a choice. You can spend your life chasing what the world says you need, or you can choose to stop, breathe, and discover what truly matters to you. Sometimes the answer lies in living what is within us, not what is imposed from the outside." Daniel looked at Elias, his eyes full of gratitude and a slight sense of clarity beginning to form within him. It wasn't a definitive answer, but right there, in that simple encounter, he felt something inside him shift. He stood up, silently thanking Elias, and went home, but this time it wasn't as usual. He felt that something inside him was beginning to awaken. In the days that followed, Daniel began to reflect more deeply on his choices. He started asking himself what he truly wanted from life, not for what others expected, but for what made his heart beat faster. He began to prioritize simple moments, to step away from the constant rush, and to seek authenticity. He learned that true peace is not in being someone in the eyes of others, but in being true to himself. And Elias? He continued sitting on the building's bench, silent and serene, always present, like a figure of wisdom, offering answers only when they were truly needed. He knew that sometimes the simplest questions are the most powerful, capable of opening doors that had long been closed within us. Daniel's story is the story of many of us. Lost in an endless pursuit of something external, we forget to ask ourselves, what do I really value? And if no one was watching, what would I do? Perhaps like Daniel, it's time to slow down, reflect, and rediscover who we are, away from the pressures of the world. The return to peace begins with a choice, and that choice is in our hands. Daniel was tired. Tired of chasing something that always seemed just out of reach. The emptiness that followed him daily had become unbearable, and he knew he needed to change. He didn't know exactly how or where to start, but something inside him, a quiet voice, told him that change didn't need to be grand, but could be built slowly with patience. He looked at his phone, the device that seemed to be his only companion lately. The screen illuminated his face with a cold glow, and he thought about how much he had lost himself in the digital world. The constant stream of information, the pressure to always be available, the endless consumption of content. None of it seemed to provide anything real in return. That day Daniel made a decision. He turned off his phone, placed it in a drawer, and for a moment he felt empty, as though he had lost a part of himself. But instead of giving in to the urge to grab it again, he sat on the couch, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. The silence was there, present, but he didn't quite know what to do with it. He stayed there for a few minutes, just listening to the sound of his own breathing. When he finally opened his eyes, something inside him felt different, as though the presence of silence had awakened something he had forgotten. The following days were filled with small adjustments. Daniel didn't rush to change everything at once. He knew that the path to rebuilding peace within himself wouldn't be easy. But, step by step, he started making different choices. The mornings that used to start in a rush, with the phone notifications being the first thing to demand his attention, now began with a cup of hot tea and a few minutes of meditation. He started to notice the details around him. The soft morning light, the sound of birds, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Small things that he had stopped paying attention to. He also began to pay more attention to meaningful conversations. Those quick encounters with friends, family, and even people he barely knew now had a new purpose. He listened more attentively, asked deeper questions without rushing to finish the conversation or get distracted by something else. The quality of interaction started to replace quantity, and something began to shift inside him. Daniel felt more connected to the people around him, more present, more whole. But perhaps the greatest change came when he began to embrace silence. Instead of filling every second with activities or external stimuli, he started giving himself time to simply be. Sitting in the park, watching the trees sway gently in the wind, or walking alone down the street, no music in his headphones, no conversations on his phone. It was as though he was rediscovering the simplicity of existence. In that silence, he began to hear his own voice again, the voice that had long been lost in the distractions of the modern world. Each day these small changes added up. His time on the phone was reduced, but gradually, without rushing. Daniel wasn't doing this out of obligation, but as a way of reclaiming something he knew he had lost. The ability to be with himself, to listen to himself, to feel life around him without rushing to the next alert. He began to rediscover the moments of peace that had always been available to him, but that he had never truly valued. The internal war that once dominated his mind started to fade. The doubts, fears, and insecurities hadn't disappeared completely, but now he faced them in a different way. He knew that balance didn't come from big victories, but from small daily choices that kept him in touch with what really mattered. Daniel learned that the path back to peace wasn't a journey that could be made overnight. It was a continuous process, a reconstruction made from the inside out. Each small act of self-care, each conscious choice to be present, helped him move away from disconnection and find balance again. He realized that true peace wasn't about escaping modern life, but learning to live in it in a healthier, more authentic way, aligned with his essence. Over time, Daniel began to feel more whole, more connected with himself and the world around him. He knew that the journey had no end, but he was at peace with the fact that each step, no matter how small, brought him closer to a place of tranquility he never knew he could find. And you? Are you ready to start making small changes in your life? The path back to peace begins with the choices you make right now, in this very moment. It doesn't need to be something grand, but something that makes sense to you. Maybe it's the time you dedicate to silence, or a deeper conversation with someone you care about. It doesn't matter the size, what matters is taking the first step. Balance is possible. And it starts with your decision. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains of Daniel's window, signaling the start of another day. He was still lying in bed, eyes closed, trying to savor the last few moments of tranquility before the world started shouting at him again. It was a routine he knew well, but something had shifted in his perspective over the past few months. The idea of peace, which once seemed like a distant, unattainable goal, now felt more possible, though never perfect. Daniel knew that modern life didn't allow for complete rest. There was no magical button to silence the constant noise, the accumulating responsibilities, the commitments, and the expectations that surrounded him. But he also knew he could choose how to react to all of this, and not every battle needed to be fought. It was the balance between war and peace, between action and silence, that he was beginning to understand. He remembered how it all started with the simple decision to put his phone in a drawer and start dedicating more time to himself. He had made small changes, but the difficulties were still there. Worries about work, moments of anxiety about the future, the challenges of maintaining healthy relationships. All of that was still part of his daily life. But something inside him had shifted. Now he knew he could navigate those challenges without losing his way. He had learned to leave some battles behind, not to react with urgency to everything, and to prioritize what truly mattered. Daniel got up, stretched slowly, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. He thought about what life had taught him. There wasn't a final point where he could rest in absolute peace. But there were, indeed, a series of moments of choice, where he could decide whether he wanted to be consumed by pressure or whether he wanted to seek balance, even amid adversity. He was no longer a slave to the frenetic pace that used to dictate his day. The war he faced was no longer about fighting everything outside of his control, but about choosing where to place his energy. Over the months, he had learned that silence, which once seemed uncomfortable, was now his source of strength. The pause, where he simply sat on a park bench or gazed at the stars at night, was where he reconnected with his essence. But that didn't mean he was at peace all the time. There were days when external pressures affected him, days when insecurities and fears arose unexpectedly. He had learned not to fight against those emotions, but to accept them as part of the journey. Daniel grabbed his coffee and sat on the balcony, watching the city in the distance. He felt a sense of lightness, but also a realization that the path would never be linear. He had learned that modern life was, in many ways, a constant battle between what the world expected of him and what he truly wanted for himself. And peace? Peace was found not in the end of battles, but in daily choices, in the way he chose to react to what was around him. He remembered the words of Elias, the mentor he had met months ago. Peace is not the absence of battle, Daniel. It is found in the ability to choose which battles you want to fight. Those words echoed in his mind, reminding him that balance was not something he could achieve all at once, but something to be sought every day with patience and self-care. The inner war he felt, with the fear of failure, insecurity about the future, the desire to please others, would not disappear. But he now knew that those battles didn't have to define his peace. He could feel fear, anxiety, and still choose not to be consumed by them. He might sometimes lose his way, but he knew that he could always reconnect with his purpose, with his essence, when needed. The balance between war and peace was not a destination, but a continuous process. He realized that, with each daily choice, he was deciding which version of himself he wanted to be. The version that gave in to external pressure or the version that sought to create a space of serenity amidst the chaos. And with that, he found an imperfect but real peace. It wasn't a static peace, but a dynamic one, adjusting to the changes in life. And so, over time, Daniel learned to dance between the two forces. He didn't need to fight against the inner war, but he could choose how to navigate it. He didn't need to wait for peace to be an absence of conflict, but could find it in the small choices he made every day. He finally understood that, by accepting life's imperfections, he could live more fully, more balanced. Today, Daniel smiles as he looks out over the city from his balcony. He still has difficult days, still faces challenges, but he knows that no matter how turbulent the external world may be, he can always return to his center, to the place of balance he has built within himself. Peace is not in avoiding war, but in choosing which battles to fight and which path to follow. And for Daniel, that was enough. Daniel walked through the park, his rhythmic steps softly echoing on the dirt path. The afternoon sun cast gentle angles over the trees, creating a dance of light and shadow around him. He breathed deeply, feeling the cool breeze brush his face. There was a serenity in his expression, a faint smile on his lips, but it wasn't the calm of someone who had found all the answers. It was the quiet peace of someone who had learned to ask the right questions. He still faced challenges as everyone did. Work remained demanding, relationships were imperfect, and the fears about the future sometimes haunted him. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel lost. He knew life was a constant journey, full of ups and downs, moments of peace and times of struggle. What mattered was how he chose to walk through it. As he walked, he reflected on everything he had experienced so far. The process of self-discovery, the small but significant changes he had made in his routine. How he had learned to listen to himself more, to step away from external pressure, and to value the simple things like a conversation with a friend, a moment of silence, or even the feeling of the sun warming his skin. He smiled because he knew that, although the journey was long and sometimes difficult, he was already on the right path. Daniel no longer believed in perfection or in the idea of arriving. He understood that peace was not a final destination but something to be cultivated day by day, choice by choice. He had discovered that true change didn't come from the big events in life, but from the small, everyday actions in the way he chose to live in the present. With each step, he reflected on how much modern life had disconnected him from himself. But now he knew that disconnection wasn't a permanent state, but something that could be overcome. Each passing day brought a new energy, a feeling of being more aligned with his purpose, even if he didn't yet know what the next step was. And that was okay. He had learned to trust the process, to trust in his ability to move forward, even without all the answers. Daniel sat on a bench near the lake, watching the ducks swim serenely. He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the peace of that instant. He thought about the choices still ahead of him, the challenges he knew he would face. But now he was more prepared. He knew he couldn't control everything, but he could control how he reacted to what life presented to him. Where is my life taking me? He wondered. There wasn't a definitive answer, no single path. But he knew that the direction of his life was in his hands, that he could each day choose what to nurture, the internal battle or the peace. He could choose every day to walk toward something more authentic, more aligned with who he truly was, not with the expectations imposed by the world around him. He smiled to himself, a silent expression of gratitude. The journey was still far from over, but he knew that as long as he continued to make choices that brought him closer to his essence, he would be on the right path. What mattered now wasn't the destination but how he walked, with awareness, with care, with the courage to be true to himself. Daniel stood up from the bench and took another step along the park path, the smile still present on his face. Life was taking him wherever he chose to go. He knew the future was a space of possibilities, and he had the power to shape it with the decisions he made every day. And you? Where is your life taking you? What can you do today to change your direction? Questions like these don't need to be answered immediately, but by reflecting on them, you may also find your way. Because in the end, the journey is made up of moments like this. Moments of reflection, of small choices, of walking toward what truly matters. The path is yours. And like Daniel, you have the ability to find it. I hope this story has touched your heart and inspired you to reflect on the path you are walking. Life is made of daily choices, and even in the most difficult moments, you have the power to decide the direction you want to follow. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the upcoming content. And of course, leave your comment. I'd love to know what you think about the story and how it resonates with your own journey. Thank you for watching, and remember, the path is yours. Let's walk this journey together.